Thank you very much, George, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for making the time today to come learn about the new process. As George mentioned in his introductory speech, we've already had some fantastic engagement with a range of consumer advocates and businesses. And I've drawn together some of the 6 or 7 thorniest questions that we've received so far in sort of anticipation of what you might ask today. So I'd be grateful, George, if we can discuss those. I mean, to begin with, you mentioned in your speech that we've recently opened cases as recently as last week into Ticketmaster. We've secured undertakings from a range of firms. A few weeks ago, secured £4 million back for consumers from Voucher. So the question I'm often asked is, do you really need these powers to be effective?
Thank you. So a major focus of that programme of enforcement work over the last 10 years, particularly since the Consumer Rights Act came into force, has been redress, putting things right, trying to fix the problem. And that's very powerful. It's also a powerful driver of compliance and will remain one. But it doesn't send a particularly powerful deterrence message. The message risks being one that all a trader will be asked to do if they are investigated is put things back to how they would have been absent the infringement. And we know from the many times that you and I and others have appeared in front of select committees, in front of the media to explain our work, that people don't think that's remotely enough, particularly for behaviour that is misleading, that is unfair, that amounts to pressure selling or aggressive sales practices. They want to see a message that spreads out wider to set an important deterrent effect to stop others doing it. There are some specifics as well of where we've seen that our powers just really aren't fit for the purpose of conducting investigations. And in particular, when it comes to our information gathering powers, which are not backed by strong sanctions, actually where firms and their advisors have directly told us that we might as well go to court because they won't be able to get the information we're seeking any quicker through them. And unfortunately, where we have settled cases with parties through undertakings, we've seen in many cases that those haven't been stuck to. We saw that, unfortunately, with our COVID-19 travel refunds work, which meant that we had to reopen investigations. All of these get fixed by the provisions of the DMCC Act, in particular, much stronger information gathering powers, making undertakings effectively binding through the ability to seek fines from businesses that fail to stick to the terms of them, and of course the ability for the CMA to directly impose civil fines and itself to order enhanced consumer measures, including redress.
I think I would add to that being effective means that consumers as well have trust and confidence in the system as a whole and how it's working, and they know that they can trust what they see. And certainly when I've had external interviews, I've frequently asked, well, why can't you fine companies? And that sort of sends a signal to consumers that any harm that they have experienced, perhaps isn't as detrimental as something on the competition side, and they don't feel as valued in that regard. So having that strong deterrent effect and having that parity with our competition rules, I think, allows us as well to be more effective. And every intervention that we make, I hope, will sort of demonstrate to consumers that we've got their backs and that they can trust that we are there and we'll stand behind them. One of the questions I'm constantly asked is, once you have your shiny new enforcement powers that will allow you to be more effective, what are the areas and issues that you're going to attack first?
Well, I can't unfortunately reveal the detail of our first cases here and now, much though I'm sure this audience would be delighted. But it won't surprise you to know that this all sits within the framework of the CMA's own stated aims and priorities, as articulated in our annual plan, and a 3-year programme of activity that sets out. That includes our determination to be consistently active in key areas of household spend, to look at those issues of whether deals are fair and whether consumers are getting great choices, but also supporting fair dealing businesses to do the right thing, and with a connection to growing the economy sustainably. So our work is very likely to sit under that sort of broader banner. You'll also be aware that the CMA is leading this year on conducting one of the sort of the biggest surveys of areas of consumer detriment. That's conducted about every sort of 2-3 years, and the CMA is leading on the commissioning and production of this year's report. That's going to be a really important source of intelligence for us, alongside the other sources that we routinely get through the consumer advocacy bodies and advice bodies from across the UK, and our own sort of sources of intelligence. But we overall, as I say, will be looking for a programme of works that achieves the greatest overall impact. And where we do take cases, we'll be looking for the impact that we can have beyond the specific enforcement action that we take within a project.
I agree. I think wherever we think that there is consumer harm and detriment, that's where we'll be. But as you would expect, we can't go into sort of further details about what those first cases will be. In your introductory remarks, you mentioned, which I completely agree with, that we know this when we talk to advisors in particular, most businesses want to do the right thing. How can they go about avoiding, firstly, sort of breaching the law, but perhaps more importantly, for their perspective, incurring a fine and kind of being on the wrong end of the CMA's wrath?
The point I made about walking the customer journey, putting yourselves in the shoes of someone experiencing your products and services is pretty fundamental, because that's what the CMA is going to make businesses do, and it's what we've done in the last 10 years of investigation, which is to ask you to explain to us what goes on, and with a genuinely kind of open investigation to get to the bottom of what has happened and what people are experiencing. It was again during the gambling investigation that I saw examples of company executives telling us that their systems worked in one way, and then sitting through a demonstration of gameplay in front of the CMA, which showed that exactly the opposite thing happened. Which suggests in that particular instance that those execs did not really understand how their processes worked. I was told, of course, you can get your money back here, here, and here. And we asked, show us. And you couldn't. That wasn't possible within their systems. So those are all things that are worth doing. They're worth doing because they will improve the consumer experience. They will make terms more fairly balanced. They will ensure you're being transparent and upfront about the core terms of your service. So they are worth doing, but they are particularly important to do in the context that these much stronger enforcement powers are coming down the line very soon. And you won't want to be explaining yourself for the first time in front of the CMA when you haven't had the chance to have that dialogue internally.
Thank you. The new regime is going to look and feel quite different. So how will businesses know whether we're open to early resolution of cases? How can they navigate the enforcement process and know when to have the right conversations with us about resolving issues?
So this is one of the big new areas for the DMCC, and it's one of the areas where we're most interested to get your views and thoughts on how the specific provisions of the DMCC on undertakings interact with our proposals around early resolution more generally, including our proposals about settlements. Clearly, undertakings in the new direct enforcement world remain on the table throughout, but we've articulated a position in our draft rules and guidance about the circumstances in where those are more or less likely, and also effectively where the CMA is still very likely to proceed to an at-fault decision. Now, there will still be that very powerful driver of being able to get things fixed for consumers as quickly as possible. But that driver is not going to stop the CMA from looking to set clear precedents, particularly where taking a decision, finding that the law has been breached, that being opened up to an appeal and seeing whether the CMA's decision stands scrutiny on appeal will be itself incredibly important. It will be important to guide other businesses, to set a deterrent impact. And there will be cases where the CMA will want to impose a fine. That will be the right thing to do, because just putting the consumer whole again isn't going to be enough to achieve the broader impact that we're looking for. But we'll be hearing a lot more about those specific provisions. Andrew will be taking us through them later. So please ask more questions there. And we'd really particularly welcome your views on that in your responses to the consultation, which obviously closes this week.
Thank you. You mentioned, sort of working quickly and at pace, and the Act introduces a duty of expedition. How will the CMA sort of balance that duty with the need to ensure that businesses have enough time to respond to the evidence and concerns that are put to them?
Yes, I mean, a lot of this goes to our mindset too as an investigative body, which is that we are not looking to find breaches, we're looking to establish what went on. And if we do identify them, to get to the bottom of that, to gather all the necessary evidence to establish whether our initial suspicions are confirmed, and if so, to move through the procedural steps that we've outlined, the issue of a provisional notice, seeking representations on that, and if we remain of the same view, to issue a final notice. We've been asked quite a bit about kind of compare and contrast with the competition regime and the direct enforcement model there. I think you need to be a bit careful with that, because the nature of competition and consumer breaches can be very substantially different. We could be talking about a single contract term. We could be talking about information, terms and conditions, a practice that is there for all to see on the website. So the information gathering need not be particularly complex. And as you say, Hayley, it's about balancing a new statutory duty on the CMA to proceed with expedition in our investigations, with ensuring that parties have a fair opportunity to understand the material that we're putting to them, the case that we're putting to them through a PIN, and to have an adequate period to respond. But if we're talking about quite small bodies of evidence and effectively a determination sometimes on a single breach, we're not talking about needing an enormous period of time for parties to put their side of the story. So it's balancing those sort of those competing breaches, and we will need to move these cases forward. That is a new duty on the CMA, and we won't be prepared to wait for lengthy periods of time for parties to come back to us.
I agree entirely, and consumers won't expect us to do that either. In these kinds of cases, there could be real and present harm that consumers are experiencing, so they will expect, and demand that both the CMA and the business work quickly together through the process to get the resolution. The draft guidance, which Andrew will talk about in more detail later, does sort of set out a different proposed decision-making process. So how are we going to make sure that businesses get a fair hearing during that investigation?
Well, for those who are familiar with the CMA sort of competition law investigations, there are a number of features of those which will feel quite familiar to you when you look at the rules and guidance relating to our direct consumer law enforcement powers. But as I said before, it starts a bit earlier than that in the overall mindset that the CMA must take, that it takes now in the cases that we bring to court, and that in the future we'll be taking through the direct enforcement model, which is to make sure that we gather evidence, that we gather inculpatory but also exculpatory evidence. We gather evidence from all the parties that we need to establish what has gone on, what has happened, and if so, to see if that confirms initial suspicions of a breach, to be prepared to stop cases where it doesn't, and where we do, to make sure that the steps of our procedure are fair and transparent, in particular giving parties the opportunity to look at the documents that we've relied on. They may be quite simple documents if it's simply a term that is on the firm's website, but where we've relied on information from third parties, making sure that that's made available as well, to give the opportunity for written representations, an oral hearing, and then the CMA to check and see whether it's comfortable to still proceed or not. And again, to be open to closing cases at that stage as well, if we're not at that point certain that a breach has occurred. And I think all of those sort of safeguards, coupled with the ability to appeal the CMA's decision, will ensure that parties will be heard, will feel heard, and that is an absolutely fundamentally important aspect of this process.
Again, it is new, and we'll sort of find our way together through it. But I think you can take sort of confidence from the fact that the way that we investigate our cases today, they are rigorous and evidence based, and in the new process that will remain exactly the same, and parties can help us in that process. You can help yourself make sure that you get a fair hearing by fully engaging and cooperating throughout the process, and making sure that you're sort of focused in the points that you make and the things that you think we need to be aware of to make a reasoned and informed judgment. I mean, finally, the CMA is a part of a much wider consumer enforcement community, including trading standards and sector regulators, and I can see some in the audience today, which is really lovely to see. How will we work with them under the new powers, and how can businesses be confident that there will be a consistent approach to issues across the consumer landscape?
So that partnership working is incredibly important to us, and I hope you've seen a lot of that, in particular where we're in similar territory to the Advertising Standards Authority, that we take great steps to make sure that we adopt, wherever possible, a common approach and speak with one voice to businesses and to the public. And a number of partnership projects with our trading standards counterparts. Most recently, our work on clear pricing in supermarkets, but also on approved trader schemes where people are looking to find a reputable builder or someone to do work at home. And it's important to remember that all of the sector regulators are being given an incredibly new, strong power to go to court to seek civil fines. And that can be particularly important where firms are looking to where the regulator needs to use the general law on top of the sector toolkit and the sector-specific provisions to tackle a particular problem, or perhaps a trader at the edge of their regulatory perimeter as well. We're absolutely committed to working together with the wider consumer protection landscape with these new powers, and can see a number of ways in which the upgrade will deliver tremendous impact across that system as a whole. It means doing things like coming together to talk about the consumer detriment study, who's doing what programs of work and activity are there to tackle these issues, what about the stuff that's remained persistently on the list of most reported consumer problems, what's our plan around that. The CMA is one part of that machine, and the primary enforcement mechanism for consumer law still remains in local authorities across the country and in the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. So we need to work with those other enforcers to make sure that we overall are delivering a programme of consumer protection work that achieves impact and protects the public.
I think that's right, and the whole system as a whole has to work together and effectively. Now, I think this is sort of the average consumer in the room is probably here today very interested in regulatory roles and legislative boundaries, but the consumer perspective is I have a problem and I'm going to the authorities that I think are responsible for fixing that problem, and you need it to work together in a unified and simple way to deliver good outcomes. That was the last of the thorny questions that I've collated in the last week. So I think now we have some time for Andrew to join us and for there to be some Q&A.